Hi, this is Forrest Lightberg with the Santa Barbara Response Network. I'm here today with two very special guests, as well as the co-founder of the Santa Barbara Response Network, Gina Carvalho, to have a conversation about racial inequality and healing. One of our guests is Reverend Julia Hamilton from the Unitarian Society of Santa Barbara. She's a powerful voice for social justice in our community and has been helping to lead us in addressing the social issues of climate change, deportation rights, inhumane treatment of prisoners at Lompoc Penitentiary, and now the issue of racial injustice, among others. Our other guest today is Reverend David Moore, who is a pastor, educator, and activist, the lead pastor of the New Covenant Worship Center, and a fierce voice for justice and racial and human equality. I just want to welcome you so much and thank you so much for being here today in this time to have this relevant and important conversation.
Pretty much the only conversation to be had today.
Thanks for the invite.
Thank you.
Sure thing. So many of us have been feeling obviously disturbed and angered and affected by what we've seen in the past week. I'd be very curious to, through this conversation, hear your thoughts on what is happening today, what circumstances have come together, and why to result in what has happened in the United States today. But first off, over 64% of all Americans do agree that racism is a major problem, but it's not discussed very much in many circles. So I'm curious about why that might be, and then what we could go from there into some other to dive into some other areas of this topic and event, which has become global at this point in many ways.
So why don't we talk about race more when we're willing to answer a survey and say we need to talk about race more?
Right.
Yeah.
I'm happy to jump in, but Dave, I'm also happy to let you have a crack at it.
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is if I were an upwardly mobile man in corporate America, aware that there were women who were more competent than myself at the job that I have, and aware that the women around me made less money than I was making, I think I could comfort myself by saying that some of my best friends are women. And, and tell everybody else that, some of my best friends, I actually live with women. So, what's the problem? And I think that numbs us to the pain that the woman is feeling, to the disenfranchisement that women feel. Well, the same thing happens racially. I think a lot of people are saying, I've got some friends who are African American, so everything must be okay. The other side of that is that there are African Americans who are so intoxicated by the potential for power by entering in relationship with white folks that they will say, some of my best friends are white, and they will be dismissive of the severe disadvantages that our people face. And they'll spread that with among other people. Usually it'll be more white people that they spread that to, that further comforts the white person that we must be doing okay.
Yeah, talking about race has repercussions. And so if you're benefiting from a system that was founded on white supremacy, and you're then talking about that system and raising the awareness of that system, then there's repercussions for that, for your career advancement, for having to have uncomfortable conversations that you don't want to have because you're just trying to eat dinner or with your family, or if you bring up the topic, you have to be prepared to talk about the topic. And the other thing that comes to mind, at least from the perspective of somebody who's grown up white, is that shame is a silencer. That shame in our lives comes up about all kinds of things, and a lot of times just silences the conversation. And there is so much we have to do to learn the history of how we got to where we are today, and to teach a new curriculum and learn things that we weren't taught in school. And a lot of that, for at least for me as a white person, is about excavating through shame and pain of that history, so that I can talk about it. You know.
No, what do you, I'm just curious because a lot of us in Santa Barbara may not be aware of what is happening with regard to racial inequality on a local level, countywide, citywide, regionally. What do you see as how is the state of things here? Most of our audience is from here, and so I think that's a relevant topic to address.
Well, if you want to hear about the state of things here, I would recommend watching the testimony that was given yesterday at the courthouse. I can't say anything that would add to what was said yesterday. So for those of you who may be watching who don't know, there was, it's called a rally or a protest, so I think of it more of as a teach-in. What really happened was a teach-in where thousands of people, I think the estimate was about 3,000 folks turned out to listen to some hard truths that were shared, graciously shared by the Black community here in Santa Barbara. And so that would be the first place I would direct people, is to sit and watch that testimony and listen to hear directly from people about their experiences in Santa Barbara.
Is that on YouTube at this point?
I think it's probably on the Facebook, the Black Lives Santa Barbara. I don't know, David, do you know where?
I don't know. I don't even know. Was it being videoed?
Surge, I think Surge did a really good, so Surge is Showing Up for Racial Justice. It's an organization that is coming alongside Black Lives Matter Santa Barbara to help support and amplify that work. And I think some of the Surge folks captured it and shared it on Facebook. I don't know that it's on YouTube yet.
I have on my timeline, I have pretty long segments of it, but it's just from my phone and standing out there trying to capture as much as I could.
Got it.
And I can find it and we can share it. So for anybody that's watching it, I can put it on SBRN and on our social feed. But for the folk that weren't there, or possibly just for right now, the takeaways, what impacted you, Julia and David, from that particular meeting?
Well, I'll say, first of all, we didn't have, and I don't say this with any sense of disrespect, we didn't have the usual suspects presenting. No government officials. But, if we're talking grassroots, that's what we heard yesterday. And for there to be such a big audience, I will say this, and I think it applies to yesterday. I have been personally contacted more in the past 3 or 4 days, 5 days, to have a conversation more often, more than at any time I can remember. And it's like a rush because I can only manage so much. And part of me responds, I've been wanting to have this conversation my whole life, and now everybody wants to talk about it all of a sudden. Yeah, I'm not sure what to do with that.
Yeah.
Well, it's something I would love to ask, and I'm not sure if we have enough time to go over it enough today, but if we think about the history and the evolution of racial inequality, civil rights in this country. It's really an interesting journey. In the last few days, ever since the murder of George Floyd, I've been listening to a lot of speeches made by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., which obviously he's one of the pivotal leaders in the civil rights movement, whose ability to orate and move the masses and lead was just earth shattering. And so it is a fascinating history, and I'm curious what your take is on where we might be now in the context of the history of the journey that African Americans have taken in this country. What is happening now? It seems like the conversation is starting to come out from what might not be comfortable or acceptable to bring out in the open. It's a little bit. It's been in the shadows a little bit, I think, from my experience as a white person in Western culture. It has been a little bit in the shadows and uncomfortable to talk about in many communities that I've been involved in.
In white communities.
Now it seems like what has happened has given so many of us permission to bring this to the forefront of what we're talking about. So what could be the effect of that? What potential does this have to move to move forward as far as racial equality goes?
So are you asking if there's hope?
Yeah, what can we do? What do you see as what can be accomplished now as a result of the fact that this is being brought to light so much on such a massive scale?
It's a big question, so we're going to ponder.
I think that the practice of conscious resistance has evolved in some really good ways. When I was a kid, you mentioned Martin Luther King, but the work that he did was very androcentric in an era where the world was male biased more than it is now.
Mm-hmm.
And so the people who joined him on the dais were men, Black Christians. Then you have people like the women who started Black Lives Matter, queer women leading the way. It's almost like they were repressed for generations and now they're standing up and throwing off their shackles. And so they speak with a sense of acute sensitivity to liberation in ways that even men have not appreciated, Black men.
Wow, that's very interesting.
Yeah.
And then you look at yesterday and you see women like Simone and Crystal and Sojourner and Julia, Chelsea for sure. You see all of these women. I mean, it was basically a woman's teaching.
Yeah.
You know, with a guy some guy in the middle got up and said something.
David spoke excellently.
But listen, I am very comfortable with women leading the way. I'm more comfortable with women leading the way now than men. But
Well,
I wanted to express my affirmation, not to displace them in any way, but just to affirm.
and I think that's,
Yeah.
that's the struggle when I was there was how do I even say anything that can be more relevant than what people have already said. I mean, it was other than just to say, listen deeply, open your heart, open your mind, unlearn some things, do your homework, read the books that are being written. Tremendous work and tremendous scholarship and tremendous insight is being put forward by Black intellectuals in our country right now that are adding to the conversation. And so, I hesitate to even try to answer that question because there are so many better people out there than me to answer questions of where are we now right? That you can be reading. You can be reading Adrienne Maree Brown. You can be reading Ibram X. Kendi. You can be reading Ta-Nehisi Coates. And so part of my silence in the response is wanting to acknowledge that I feel like my role is to point people toward voices, toward a way to open hearts, to be in a space to then listen to that history and story in a different way that will maybe hopefully change, so we don't repeat the same stories that are harming people.
So yeah. So in a sense, are you referring to getting a sense of the history of the roots of this issue and how it's evolved over the centuries? That can help us to break the patterns that we're in right now.
I think it's critical, because one of the disclaimers that always comes up in white culture is, well, it's not my history. It's not, I don't own the history of my ancestors, right? They were them, I'm me. I can't be held responsible for history. I hear that sidestep all the time, and that's missing the point entirely, to say, well, I can't be responsible for history. And it's a way of not having to do the work.
Yeah. When you see young Black women being shot by law enforcement in their own homes, and you don't see a national outcry, it helps point us to the fact that having on video the death of George Floyd is not really just about George Floyd. The uprising. It's about historic segregation, lack of access to jobs, hiring and firing discrimination, redlining. Our neighborhoods have been segregated from the beginning. Black people not being allowed to live in certain places, not
Here in Santa Barbara.
Loans. So this is something that goes back into the past we live with right now, but people tend to think that those inequities have been erased.
Right.
They see affirmative action as the country doing us a favor, when we've been underpaid for centuries. So I don't see any of that as a favor.
Yeah.
Now, what do you see as ways, strategies, methods that we can adopt to support healing in this area? I mean, what are some things that people like myself or Gina or Reverend Julia or any of us might be able to adopt, to be supportive?
This might be a good time to read what the Black Lives Matter Santa Barbara put forth yesterday. I pulled it up. I don't know, Dave, if you want to chime in first, but I'm waiting to, there were 5 demands that were local, and they're actionable. So when people say, what can I do? There's a list right here in front of us now.
Well,
right?
That's very, very nice, because sometimes it can feel like this is something that's not in our control, maybe in our realm of influence. And one individual, how much can, right? There's often that kind of thinking. So it would be very nice to hear those 5.
David, did you want to chime in, or I can?
No, go ahead with that.
Okay, so I pulled them up on my other computer here. So give me just a second here. Okay, these are the 5 demands that were put forth yesterday. We demand that Santa Barbara City Council adopt a resolution condemning police brutality and declare racism a public health emergency. We demand transparency and accountability from the Santa Barbara Police Department. No more community conversation without changes to policy and practices. No more internal investigations of misconduct. Create a civilian review board with members selected by community. prioritize mental health services and rehabilitation. We demand transparency and accountability from the Santa Barbara County Sheriff. Update use of force policy to center de-escalation. No isolation or quarantine for inmates attending court or contacting their lawyers. Reduce jail admissions by redirecting people to community-based mental health and substance abuse treatment services. We demand protection and preservation of Black landmarks rather than monuments to white supremacy. St. Paul AME, Friendship Baptist Church, and Franklin Neighborhood Center have been symbols for Black unity and peace. Prioritize the restoration of these spaces and name their Black creators. We demand institutional support for an annual Juneteenth celebration. A city and county commitment to allocate funds for this annual celebration of Black emancipation and liberation. So those are the very concrete, very local, very specific demands that we can work towards if people want to know what to do.
So, yeah. And now, of course, we have city council, county supervisor meetings that the public can make comment in. So, you know, that seems to be a nice platform. And the only thing is, hopefully that the elected officials actually listen and I mean, do something. But I was surprised, David, that you mentioned that none of the local government officials actually spoke.
Well, let me, Julia, you were there before I was. Did anyone?
No, this was not a moment, a political, I mean, it was a political moment, but it was not a moment for politicians. So that I know there were elected officials there who are present and hopefully listening.
Yeah, to me, it is emotionally eviscerating to see the carnage, to see the exclusion and oppression. I want to be specific. I talked about African American women being shot in their homes. I want to mention their names. In 2015, Megan Hockaday, right down the road in Oxnard, was shot by the Oxnard Police Department. And then Tatiana Jefferson, and then Breonna Taylor. Two of them were 26 and one was 28 years old. I'm sure they're a major threat to society, so they needed to be taken out.
I wanted to have this conversation because as a white woman, but a white immigrant woman, but when I think about privilege, and we'll talk about white privilege, I really I feel like we need to demand conversations, but we need to look clearly in the face of injustice. And we really need to look at the fact that it isn't the same for everybody in this community. If you're brown or you're Black or you don't speak, it's not the same. People don't want to really look that in the face and say, if I'm a brown-skinned person and I'm arrested, it's going to be very different for me in that situation than from another situation. And we like to think in fairyland that we really are looking at people equally. We're not. And that people are fed up. We're angry. This is not what the world that I want to live in and any of us want to live in. But in order to transform it, in order to move it forward, we have to really talk about these things with a sense of urgency. We have children, we have women, we have people being murdered. This is something we have to all take a personal, I mean, it's our community and it's our country and it's our world. And so I feel like I'm outraged, frankly, at what continues to happen. And if elected officials and people in power don't really look at the fact that not much has changed, we're not going to move forward. So I just want to have dialogue. I want to say, like, I want to give a voice to people who are angry, because this has been going on for a long time. This is not new, you know.
Well,
seeing what we see on the news, that it's basically a lynching on the street. I mean, that's what we're seeing.
And
Anyway,
we're seeing a video recorded lynching. We don't see the societal lynching and emotional lynching, and these things are not featured in the mainstream. They're overlooked. They're intentionally overlooked. Even our news, it's our news is owned by major corporations for the most part, unless unless it's an independent agency. And when we look at the wealth disparity, the income inequality, we tend to look at the police as enforcers of that system of inequality. And so it's hard for us to really get on board with saying, everybody, let's all respect law enforcement. That's like telling everybody to say the Pledge of Allegiance, no matter what's in your heart.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I kind of raised that. I raised that specter of, are you asking about hope? And Dr. James, it was Cornell West. Dr. Cornell West said, there's been a lynching. It was caught on video. And thank God there are people in the streets, because otherwise it would have meant that we were indifferent.
Mm-hmm.
And that gave me hope, because, I think it was Eli Wiesel who said the opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference. And so if we claim to be a people of love, and I know, speaking as, a faith leader and working in interfaith context, so often we use love as that thing that binds us together. We have different traditions, we have different holy books, we have different rituals, but we can come together on this common ground of love. If we claim to be a people of love, then we have to reject indifference. And we can be angry, we can be heartbroken, we can be motivated by all kinds of things, but we have to move out of indifference. And what we're seeing is, and maybe this goes back to that first question you were asking for us about how many people, respond, yes, it's an important conversation, but don't want to have it. Thank God there are people in the streets, because at least it means we weren't indifferent.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And, alongside that, we still have a strong Christian influence in this country. And there are some people who are asking the question, where is the forgiveness? Like, forgive the officer who killed George Floyd. Forgive all of those officers. Just keep forgiving, because that's the Christian thing to do. But they grievously overlook the fact that you can forgive individuals, but you cannot forgive a system. And that's what our problem is. We have Christians who are thinking that it's all about individual faith, individual spiritual practice, when there is collective oppression going on, destroying people's lives in the name of the very Savior that you're proclaiming, that brings peace and forgiveness.
Right.
I'm going to nod my head so hard it's going to fall off of my body. Right? This individualism is going to kill us. If we treat everything like an individual choice, right? That I'm not responsible for history because I'm an individual alive today. I'm not, those police officers were just individuals. It's just bad apples. And we don't see those systems. We don't see the community and collective life both has the power to kill us and the power to save us. And if we don't acknowledge the power of collective life, we both can't see the truth of what's happening, the collective systems of white supremacy that are killing us, and we also cut ourselves off from the power that we need to change things. Yeah. When we're just, and look at what's happened with COVID and the virus in this, the individualism that is literally killing us with this virus because we refuse to take collective action to protect each other.
Further on forgiveness, Julia, is when we urge people to forgive, they immediately think that it's also to forget. And we, again, we cannot forgive systems. To say that we need to forgive right now, what we're really saying is that we need to overlook white supremacy. That's really what it's saying. It's saying pretend white supremacy isn't that bad and you can survive it. We're not surviving it. We're dying because of it. And Julia mentioned COVID-19, and we're well aware that this affects communities of colors and especially African Americans. I mean, I hear regularly of the family of people that I know dying from COVID-19, and this is a reality that is directly connected to segregation. It's connected to slavery. I mean, the fact that diabetes is the #1 condition that leads to mortality to COVID-19. Diabetes, hypertension, um, obesity, these are conditions that are connected to poverty. You can trace them directly to slavery and to Jim Crow and to redlining. And this is killing. I have a friend who calls it passive ethnic cleansing. And so to forgive sounds altruistic, but it's anything but. It's irresponsible.
And we have a whole healthcare system built on denying Black pain. I mean, you look at the studies about how doctors treat different patients when they walk in with a complaint, and it's just horrible how long it takes somebody to testify to what they're experiencing in their body before they get the treatment or the care or the attention. And so I've definitely heard stories about people who have been sick and they've gone in and they just get dismissed and dismissed and dismissed. And that's a legacy of history. The denial of Black pain is a legacy of history. It was a way that we engineered a system that allowed white supremacy to survive.
I want to talk a little bit right now about trauma. In these communities that we're talking about, there's an incredible amount of trauma, intergenerational trauma, having experienced poverty, violence, the outrage and unexpressed anger. As part of the Santa Barbara Response Network, we respond to trauma of all kinds. I want you to speak to the fact that we have a lot of unresolved trauma around race, and we have people experiencing, and right now, all of us are in a state of trauma. If you watch any of this media, and you're going, right now, we're also going through COVID, we're all in a highly traumatized state. So I wanted to ask each of you, how, or if you have any words to help us to navigate this heightened state that we're all feeling. And anger is healthy. I'm not saying repress anger, I think that's part of healing, but if there's anything that you want to share with us about this sense of collective trauma and outrage that we're all feeling, I would appreciate your words of wisdom to share with me and with others of how we can deal with this and navigate through this.
I had an experience earlier today that might speak to that. I have a friend who was talking about how there are Black high school students who are directed not according to their intelligence and potential, but according to the expectations of the high school counselor. And it caused me to reflect. I went to high school a long time ago, class of 72, but I had a counselor, and I was moved by this today. Larry Murray, white guy, took me out with his sons on his boat on Lake Casitas, sat down with my mom to help fill out college applications. Our family didn't have a history with college. Loan applications. I mean, he really invested time. And so that memory nourished me today and gave me hope. And I think that I'm searching for memories that keep me sane.
One of the other calls I heard yesterday was for more culturally competent therapists and medical professionals, mental health professionals, that there is a dearth in our community of people who can really address trauma, race-based trauma, and that we need to be training people to understand that it's different, and we need to be encouraging people of color in their careers as therapists, as mental health workers, as caregivers, because they have a voice and a perspective that is desperately needed to help people heal.
That's a really important point, because I know that African Americans in our community who seek for therapy often end up being the teachers of their therapists, and that's not why you're paying to be there.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, it's like one more assignment.
Yeah.
So, you know, this could be
absolutely.
a conversation.
Absolutely.
This could be a conversation that goes for, of course, hours long, and it should go for longer than that. And I think we all have a responsibility to bring this into
well, it will continue on Wednesday, because it's too big a conversation to let go. So I'm going to have SBRN Facebook Live will be Wednesday also, looking at this, and hopefully we'll look at some of the other members of our community, Brown. I mean, let's just bring everybody in and talk about what our experiences are today, because we need to keep talking about how we're going to cohabitate. And when David, when you were talking, it reminded me also of our Native American First Nations people. I'm Canadian, so you know I live with First Nations people, and the fact that we're, you know, that nation, again, another one, tremendous trauma, generations of trauma, and again, we don't want to talk about it, we don't want to deal with it. So I'm just opening it up, not to open the wound, but to open the opportunity to air out what we all have seen and experienced in our lifetime that has caused, I mean, both of you are such fierce voices for justice. And that's what I wanted you both on, because you see these inequalities and you say, no. And we need to be with you on that platform and say, no, this is not what I'm here for. This is not what I'm supporting. So I want to thank you and honor you for being brave, for seeing all of these things, from the climate to what's happening in Lompoc, to what's happening with our farm workers, what's happening with the people who don't have a voice. We somehow have to be that voice, and you have been that voice, both David and Julia. You've been that voice, and SBRN has been there to support the community and these families, and we will continue to do that. But I am deeply indebted to both of you for having the courage to just keep speaking truth. Just speaking truth to power. You just keep going. And so thank you. And I honor you and support you. And I'm in the fight with you.
It's nothing we can do on our own.
Respect to Indigenous peoples and to refugees. You know, I was listening to a Vietnamese American author by the name of Viet Thanh Nguyen, who pointed out that Asians are expected to be grateful, as though the country was hosting them graciously. And he said, but if you never would have bombed our country to smithereens, we wouldn't even be here as Vietnamese refugees. I see myself as the son of refugees, migrants, because my parents were part of the Great Migration, fleeing the American South so that their kids could possibly have a better life. And so there is a real bond between the way that I live and the way that I think and the people who are detained by ICE and people who are sent out of the country after living and working here all of their lives. This is not theoretical for me. This is visceral. I feel it because I am them.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Well, Forrest,
Wow, it's just,
I think you're taking it in, huh? Yeah.
so thank you so much, both of you, for this. The network, the Santa Barbara Response Network. I'm Gina and I know I speak for Gina. Are really grateful to have brought you on to have had this conversation, so that this conversation can continue to happen and expand through the network of the Santa Barbara Response Network and its constituency, as well as the networks of those constituency members and their networks and there could be a domino effect. So I just want to thank you very much for your time today. And such an interesting time we're living in that this is, I'm looking forward to what I hope is a track that we're on to beginning to heal this issue even more than we ever have before. Just another step in the evolution of our society. So thank you so much for your time today.
And power to the Santa Barbara Response Network.
Yes, for showing up where people are hurting. It takes a lot of courage to show up where there's been trauma and tragedy and to accompany people through their pain. And so
absolutely
doing that work is important and courageous.
To the volunteers of the network as well.
Thank you to all our volunteers.
Mm-hmm. Literally hundreds of volunteers. It's just really
on the front line from COVID, helping a lot of families. And of course, as we know, a lot of families in Santa Maria and other places that aren't getting the help, they're reaching out and we're able to get them services, support, psychological, emotional, physical, food. There's a lot of hungry people in our community. So we're here. So the Santa Barbara Response Network and our partners and supporters, thank you very much. And we'll continue the conversation on Wednesday. And thank you both. I have such deep feeling for both of you. My heart is very full and grateful to both of you for your work and your care. Take care.
Love.
Take care of yourself, people.
Love.
Take care of each other too.